Brian Hunter had always been a man who valued his independence and self-reliance. A lifelong farmer, he recently decided to purchase a large piece of land on the outskirts of town, envisioning it as the perfect expansion for his growing livestock business. The property, with its rolling hills, dense patches of trees, and fertile soil, was exactly what he needed to create a sustainable ranch that could support both his animals and his long-term plans for self-sufficiency. It wasn't just a piece of land to him, it was an investment in his future, something he could pass down one day. Brian was a practical man, not prone to drama or conflict, but as he would soon learn, peace and ownership don't always come without a fight. The first few weeks after purchasing the property were uneventful, and Brian quickly got to work inspecting the land, setting up fencing, and introducing his livestock to the new pastures. He preferred to keep to himself, but the occasional polite interaction with a few of his neighbors painted a picture of the surrounding community. Most seemed friendly enough, but one stood out: Mark West, who owned a house on the adjacent property. Mark was the kind of man who thrived on being the loudest voice in any room. His yard was cluttered with construction equipment, trailers, and stacks of materials that had seemingly been abandoned mid-use. Brian couldn't tell if Mark was running a business, or just a man with too many hobbies, but he got the sense that his new neighbor was not the type to ask for permission before doing something. It was on a crisp Monday morning, while walking along the edge of his property to check the integrity of a fence, that Brian first noticed something strange. The grass in one area looked disturbed, as if it had been dug up recently. As he followed the trail, he saw a shallow trench stretching across his field, cutting through his pasture, and disappearing into the tree line that separated his land from Mark's. In the trench lay a thick black cable, partially covered with loose dirt but still clearly visible in spots. Brian crouched down to get a better look, brushing away some of the soil. It was an industrial-grade electrical cable, the kind you'd expect to see connected to a high-demand power source. The sight of it made him uneasy. Why was it there? Who had put it there? And, more importantly, why hadn't he been told? Brian straightened up, scanning the area around him. The more he looked, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just a small project. The trench was too long and too cleanly dug to have been the work of wildlife or natural causes. Someone had been here on his land without his knowledge. His jaw tightened. As a landowner, Brian took his property rights seriously, and the idea that someone had crossed those boundaries without so much as a heads-up infuriated him. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he had a sinking feeling he already knew who was responsible. Mark West had been the only person he'd seen on this side of the property since he moved in. Deciding he needed answers, Brian followed the trench toward the tree line, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing the cable any further. The trench wound through the undergrowth and eventually spilled out onto Mark's property, where it terminated in a tangled mess of cables connected to a large generator parked behind Mark's barn. The generator was humming softly, its dull drone blending into the background noise of the countryside. Brian stood there for a moment, taking in the scene, his irritation growing. There was no mistaking it now: Mark had installed this cable without asking for permission. Brian took a deep breath, trying to calm himself before marching over to Mark's front door. He didn't want to start a confrontation, but he also couldn't let this slide. Property lines existed for a reason, and Mark had crossed one literally. As Brian approached the house, he noticed a stack of empty energy drink cans piled near the door and a pair of muddy work boots left haphazardly on the porch. He knocked firmly, stepping back to wait. After a few moments, the door creaked open and Mark appeared, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and irritation. "Brian," right, Mark said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What brings you over?" Brian got straight to the point. "I was walking my property this morning and noticed a trench with a cable running through my field. It leads straight to your generator. Care to explain why it's there?" Mark blinked, then waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, that? It's just temporary. I'm running some tests with the generator, and I needed a good stretch of open land for the cable. It's no big deal, I'll have it out of there soon." Brian frowned. "You didn't think to ask first? That's my land you're digging through." Mark shrugged. the nonchalance in his demeanor only fueling Brian's frustration. "Didn't think you'd mind. It's just a cable. It's not like I'm building a skyscraper or something. I'll cover the trench back up when I'm done. No harm, no foul." "No harm," Brian's voice tightened. "You've damaged my pasture and trespassed on my property. That's more than just no harm. If something happens to that cable, I'm assuming you'll take responsibility, right?" Mark's easygoing facade cracked for a moment, and his tone grew sharper. "Well, yeah, but I don't see why you'd need to touch it. Just leave it be, and I'll handle everything. You don't need to make this a big deal." Brian's patience was wearing thin. "This is a big deal, Mark. You can't just do whatever you want on someone else's property. I want that cable removed. Now." Mark crossed his arms, his posture shifting defensively. "Look, I'm not trying to start something here, but I can't move it right this second. It's connected to equipment I'm using for a project, and if I shut it down now, it'll set me back weeks. Just give me some time and I'll take care of it, all right?" Brian didn't like the way Mark was brushing off his concerns, but he also knew he wasn't going to get anywhere by arguing on the porch. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his property, his mind racing with questions. Why had Mark been so dismissive? What kind of project required a cable running through someone else's land? And most importantly, how far was Mark willing to push this boundary? As Brian returned to the site of the trench, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger problem. Over the next couple of days, Brian couldn't get the cable out of his mind. Every time he passed by the trench, the sight of it gnawed at him. Mark's dismissive attitude and casual disregard for boundaries didn't sit well with him, and the longer the cable stayed, the more it felt like an invasion. Brian wasn't the kind of man to rush into conflict, but he was also no pushover. He believed in fairness and respect, and it was clear Mark had no intention of honoring either. The more Brian thought about it, the more determined he became to take action. This wasn't just about a cable, it was about protecting his land and making sure no one thought they could walk all over him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the countryside was bathed in shades of orange and purple, Brian decided to inspect the trench more closely. Armed with a flashlight, he walked the length of the cable, noting how it twisted and turned across his pasture. The trench wasn't particularly deep, and the cable was only loosely covered with soil in some places, as if whoever had installed it hadn't been too concerned about hiding it. Brian stopped near the spot where the cable crossed a section of his irrigation system. There he noticed something that made his stomach turn. A portion of the pipe had been cracked, likely from the equipment used to dig the trench. Water was leaking slowly, pooling in the disturbed soil around it. Brian crouched down and ran his fingers over the damaged pipe. This wasn't a small issue. A broken irrigation pipe could disrupt his entire water system, which was critical for his livestock and the crops he planned to grow. This wasn't just a matter of principle anymore, it was starting to affect his livelihood. He grabbed his phone and snapped a few pictures of the damage, making sure to document the extent of the leak and the proximity of the trench. Mark's carelessness had crossed into dangerous territory, and Brian wasn't about to let it slide. The next morning, Brian drove into town to meet with a lawyer. He decided it was time to get some professional advice about how to handle the situation. The attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Allison, listened intently as Brian explained the situation, showing her the pictures of the trench and the damaged pipe. She nodded thoughtfully as he spoke, occasionally jotting down notes on a legal pad. "Well," she said when he finished, "you're absolutely in the right here. Your property rights are clear, and Mark has no legal basis to install anything on your land without your permission. Trespassing alone is a serious offense. But the fact that his actions are causing actual damage to your property makes this even more serious. We need to act quickly." Brian felt a wave of relief at her confidence, but he also knew this wouldn't be as simple as sending a letter. Mark wasn't the type to back down easily. "What's the first step?" he asked. Allison leaned back in her chair. "We'll start with a formal demand letter. It'll outline the trespass, the damage to your property, and the requirement that he removes the cable immediately. If he refuses, we'll escalate from there. I'll also recommend contacting the local government to check for any permits he might have filed. If he's operating without them, That's another layer of liability we can use. Brian nodded. It was a solid plan, and he felt reassured knowing he had someone in his corner. Allison wasted no time drafting the letter, and by the end of the day, it was hand-delivered to Mark's property. Brian didn't stick around to see Mark's reaction, but he could imagine it wasn't a pleasant one. For a few days, it seemed like the situation might resolve itself. Mark didn't make any attempts to contact Brian, and no further work appeared to be happening near the trench. But just as Brian began to relax, the other shoe dropped. Late one afternoon, as Brian was fixing a section of fencing near the southern edge of his property, he noticed a utility truck parked near the trench. 2 workers were crouched near the cable, examining it and taking notes on clipboards. Brian approached them cautiously, not wanting to startle them. After noon, he called out, his voice steady but firm. "Can I help you with something?" One of the workers, a younger man with a ball cap pulled low over his eyes, looked up and frowned. "We're just here to inspect the cable," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "We got a request from the owner to check for any damage." Brian's eyes narrowed. "The owner? That cable is running through my property without my permission. Did Mark tell you he had permission to put it here?" The worker hesitated, glancing at his partner. "Look, we're just contractors. We were told to check the line and make sure everything's operational. That's all." Brian crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "Well, you can tell Mark he doesn't have the right to install anything here, let alone send people onto my land without notice. I expect the cable gone by the end of the week, or we're going to have a bigger problem." The workers exchanged another uneasy glance before nodding and packing up their tools. As they drove off, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Mark was playing a game, and Brian was determined not to lose. That night, Brian was woken by a loud crackling sound coming from outside. Groggy and disoriented, he grabbed a flashlight and stumbled out onto his porch. The sound was coming from the direction of the trench. As he got closer, he saw sparks flying from the cable where it crossed over the damaged irrigation pipe. A faint smell of burning plastic filled the air, and Brian's heart sank. This wasn't just a trespassing issue anymore, it was a safety hazard. Acting quickly, Brian grabbed a fire extinguisher from his barn and doused the area around the cable to prevent the dry grass from catching fire. Once the immediate danger was contained, he called the local fire department to report the incident. By the time they arrived, the cable had stopped sparking, but the damage was clear. The fire chief, a grizzled man with decades of experience, shook his head as he examined the scene. "This is bad," he said. "That cable's carrying a lot of voltage, and it's not properly insulated. If this had been left unattended, it could have started a wildfire." Brian felt a mix of anger and vindication. Mark's negligence had nearly caused a disaster, and there was no way he could ignore it now. The fire chief filed an official report, which Brian knew would be invaluable as evidence if the situation went to court. The next day, Brian received a call from Allison. She'd heard about the incident and was already preparing the next steps. "This changes things," she said. "Mark's actions have gone beyond trespassing and property damage. He's created a public safety risk. We can use this to strengthen our case and force him to remove the cable immediately." Brian nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Mark might have thought he could push his way through this, but he underestimated just how far Brian was willing to go to protect what was his. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore, it was about standing up for himself and making sure no one else tried to take advantage of him again. Over the next few days, Brian found himself more on edge than ever. The sparking cable incident had made it abundantly clear that Mark's actions weren't just an annoyance, they were a genuine threat. If the situation had escalated to the point of nearly causing a fire, there was no telling what might happen next. Despite his frustration, Brian knew he needed to stay level-headed. Acting impulsively wouldn't solve anything, and if he was going to come out of this with his property and his safety intact, he had to approach the situation strategically. The first thing Brian did was revisit the fire chief's report. The document clearly stated that the improperly installed cable posed a fire hazard and violated local safety codes. Allison, his lawyer, had advised him to send a copy to the local utility company to ensure they were aware of the issue. If Mark had bypassed official channels to connect the cable, the utility company could hold him accountable. Brian also sent the report to the county zoning office, along with a formal complaint about the unauthorized trench and the damage it had caused to his irrigation system. It was clear that Mark's negligence wasn't going unnoticed anymore. But while Brian worked on addressing the issue through the proper channels, Mark seemed determined to double down. One afternoon, as Brian was repairing the cracked irrigation pipe near the trench, he spotted Mark standing on the edge of his property, watching him with a smirk that sent a surge of irritation through Brian's chest. Mark didn't call out or make any gestures, he just stood there, as if silently daring Brian to confront him. Brian ignored him, focusing instead on his repairs. Engaging with Mark on his terms would only escalate things further, and Brian wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. The next morning, Brian was greeted by an unpleasant surprise. As he stepped out onto his porch with his morning coffee, he noticed something unusual near the trench. Someone had placed a series of orange flags along the edge of the trench, marking its path across his property. The sight made his stomach twist. It wasn't just the audacity of the flags, it was what they represented. Whoever had placed them was treating the trench and the cable as though they had a legitimate claim to be there, as if Brian's land wasn't his to defend. Brian approached the flags cautiously, examining them more closely. Each one bore the logo of a local construction company, along with a number scrawled in black marker. He felt a fresh wave of anger bubbling up. If Mark had hired a contractor to do more work on the trench without even speaking to him, it was an outright declaration of disrespect. Brian immediately pulled out his phone and called Allison, explaining what he'd found. "That's a bold move," Allison said, her tone laced with disbelief. "He's not even trying to hide what he's doing anymore. Have you contacted the construction company?" "Not yet," Brian admitted. "I wanted to talk to you first." "Good call," Allison said. "Here's what I suggest. Call them and explain that the trench is on your property and was installed without your permission. Make it clear that any further work will be considered trespassing. Most reputable companies will back off once they realize they're being dragged into a legal dispute. If they don't, we'll escalate." Brian nodded, grateful for her guidance. After hanging up, he immediately dialed the number printed on one of the flags. A woman answered, her tone brisk and professional. Brian explained the situation as calmly as he could, emphasizing that the trench and cable had been installed without his consent, and that the company had no right to conduct any further work on his land. The woman hesitated. "I see," she said finally. "I'll need to speak with my supervisor about this. We were hired to mark the area for an upcoming project, but if there's a dispute over the property, we'll hold off until it's resolved." Brian thanked her and ended the call, feeling a small sense of relief. At least the construction company seemed willing to play by the rules, unlike Mark. But the encounter left him wondering what upcoming project was Mark planning? And why did it involve digging deeper into Brian's property? That question lingered in his mind as the day wore on, and by evening it had grown into a gnawing sense of unease. Determined to get some answers, Brian decided to do a bit of his own research. He started by reviewing the property records at the county office, looking for any permits or applications that Mark might have filed. To his surprise, there was nothing. No building permits, no excavation request, nothing to suggest that Mark had any legal basis for his actions. Frustrated but undeterred, Brian decided to take a closer look at Mark's property. He didn't want to trespass, but from his own land he could see enough to get a better sense of what was going on. As dusk fell, Brian grabbed a pair of binoculars and positioned himself near the edge of his property, where the trench disappeared into the tree line. From there, he had a clear view of the area behind Mark's barn, where the generator and cables were located. What he saw made his blood run cold. Mark had set up a row of large battery packs next to the generator, and several men were working to connect them to the cable. The setup looked more industrial than residential, and it was clear this wasn't just about powering Mark's house. Brian's mind raced with possibilities. Was Mark selling power to someone else? Was he using Brian's land as part of an illegal operation? Whatever the answer, it was clear that Mark wasn't going to stop unless he was forced to. The next day, Brian took the fire chief's report, the photos of the trench, and the evidence of the battery packs to the local zoning office. He filed a second formal complaint, this time emphasizing the potential environmental and safety hazards posed by the setup. The clerk who took his complaint assured him that an inspector would be sent out to investigate, but Brian couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. Mark had already shown that he was willing to bend or outright break the rules to get what he wanted. Sure enough, just 2 days later, Brian noticed fresh tire tracks leading from the road to the trench. Someone had been there during the night, and they'd brought equipment with them. Furious, Brian called the local sheriff's department to report the unauthorized activity. A deputy arrived later that afternoon to take a statement, but there wasn't much he could do beyond filing a report. "Look," the deputy said, scratching the back of his neck, "these kinds of disputes can get messy. If you're serious about stopping this, you'll need to keep documenting everything and work through your lawyer. We'll back you up where we can, but this is mostly a civil matter." Brian clenched his jaw, frustrated by the lack of immediate action, but he thanked the deputy and resolved to keep pushing. He wasn't about to let Mark trample over his rights without a fight. As the sun set that evening, Brian stood near the trench, staring at the orange flags fluttering in the breeze. He didn't know how long this battle would last, but he was ready to see it through, no matter what it took. Mark might have started this war, but Brian was determined to finish it. As the situation continued to escalate, Brian felt the weight of the conflict pressing down on him. The trench, the cable, the uninvited workers, and Mark's blatant disregard for property rights had turned what should have been a peaceful life on his land into a daily battle. Each day brought new complications, and Brian knew that if he didn't find a way to force Mark's hand soon, things would only get worse. His frustration grew with every passing moment, but he channeled that energy into action, determined to outthink and outmaneuver his arrogant neighbor. The breaking point came one humid afternoon when Brian noticed something strange near the trench. The cable, which had previously been covered with loose dirt in most places, was now exposed in several spots, as if someone had deliberately unearthed it. Worse, there were signs that someone had driven heavy equipment across Brian's pasture to reach the trench. The deep tire tracks gouged into the grass and soil weren't just an eyesore, they were further proof that Mark had no intention of respecting boundaries. Brian crouched by the trench, inspecting the newly exposed cable, and noticed that parts of the insulation were frayed. The damage wasn't accidental, it looked deliberate, as though someone had been tampering with it. Taking out his phone, Brian snapped pictures of the cable, the tire tracks, and the surrounding area. He made sure to capture every detail, knowing he'd need more evidence to strengthen his case. As he worked, the air seemed to grow heavier, and a low rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. Brian glanced up at the darkening sky, his jaw tightening. The last thing he needed was a storm to complicate things further, but it seemed that trouble was coming, whether he liked it or not. Later that evening, as rain lashed against the windows of his house, Brian sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the photos and notes he'd collected. His frustration was mounting. He'd already filed complaints with the zoning office and contacted the local utility company, but progress was slow, and Mark's defiance was escalating. Brian was no stranger to hard work, but this wasn't something he could fix with his hands or a few tools. He needed more leverage, something that would force Mark to back down once and for all. That's when Allison called. The sound of her voice was steady, but Brian could sense the urgency behind her words. "I've got some news," she said. "I've been digging into Mark's activities, and it looks like we found something interesting. He hasn't filed any permits for the trench or the cable, which we already suspected. But here's the kicker: I spoke to someone at the utility company, and they confirmed that the cable isn't connected to their grid. Whatever Mark is doing, it's completely off the books." Brian leaned forward, gripping the phone tightly. "So, what does that mean? Is he running some kind of illegal operation?" "It's starting to look that way," Allison replied. "The utility company told me that they've been investigating reports of unauthorized power distribution in the area. They suspect that someone's been generating electricity privately and selling it to others without going through the proper channels. If that's what Mark is doing, he's not just trespassing on your property, he's committing a serious violation." Brian let out a slow breath, his mind racing. It made sense. The generator, the industrial cable, the row of battery packs he'd seen behind Mark's barn, it all pointed to something bigger than just a neighborly dispute. Mark wasn't just cutting corners, he was actively breaking the law, and he was using Brian's land to do it. "What's our next move?" Brian asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "We need to document everything," Allison said firmly. "Take detailed notes, photos, and videos of any changes you notice on your property. If you see any workers or equipment, get their names and take pictures of their vehicles if you can do so safely. I'm also reaching out to the zoning office to push for an immediate inspection. If we can prove that Mark is using your land for illegal activities, we'll have more than enough to take him down." Brian thanked her and hung up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about protecting his land anymore, it was about holding Mark accountable for his actions. But as the rain continued to hammer against the roof, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that Mark wasn't going to go down without a fight. The next morning, Brian was up early, walking his property to assess the damage from the storm. The rain had turned the ground into a soggy mess, and the tire tracks near the trench were now filled with muddy water. As he approached the area where the cable ran, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Someone had been there during the night. Fresh footprints in the mud led from the edge of the trench to the tree line, disappearing into the dense woods that bordered his property. Brian's pulse quickened. Whoever it was, they hadn't bothered to cover their tracks, literally or figuratively. Following the trail cautiously, Brian reached the tree line and stopped. He scanned the woods, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out any signs of movement. The forest was quiet, save for the distant chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Whoever had been there was long gone, but the implications were clear. Mark or someone working for him had been on Brian's land again, despite the growing legal pressure. It was a blatant act of defiance, a message that Mark wasn't going to back down easily. Brian took out his phone and snapped pictures of the footprints before heading back to his house. He spent the next few hours compiling everything he had: photos, notes, legal documents, and the fire chief's report. By the time he was done, he had a comprehensive record of Mark's trespasses and the damage they'd caused. Brian sent the file to Allison, knowing it would be a valuable weapon in the fight ahead. But just as Brian was starting to feel like he was gaining the upper hand, Mark made his next move. That afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up to the edge of Brian's property, and several large crates were unloaded near the trench. Brian watched from a distance, his jaw tightening as he recognized the logo on the crates. They belonged to a company that specialized in high-capacity battery systems, the kind used in off-grid power setups. It was more proof that Mark was running an unauthorized operation, but it was also a clear sign that he wasn't planning to stop anytime soon. Unable to contain his frustration any longer, Brian marched over to the edge of his property and called out to the workers unloading the crates. "Hey, what do you think you're doing? That's private property, you've got no right to be here." One of the workers, a burly man in a reflective vest, turned and shrugged. "We're just making a delivery. Talk to the guy who ordered it." Brian clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "Tell your boss he's crossing the line. If I see any more equipment on my property, I'm calling the sheriff." The worker nodded, clearly uninterested in getting involved, and returned to his task. Brian walked away, his mind racing. Mark was pushing harder than ever, and it was clear that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself quietly. Brian had to be prepared for whatever came next. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Brian sat on his porch, staring out at the trench in the fading light. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew he couldn't afford to back down. Mark had underestimated him, and Brian was determined to show him just how wrong he was. The escalating conflict with Mark had turned Brian's once peaceful property into a battleground. Every day brought new signs that his neighbor was pushing boundaries further, and Brian knew he had to stay ahead of Mark's schemes. The arrival of the battery crates near the trench was the latest provocation, a clear message that Mark had no intention of stopping or even slowing down. But what troubled Brian more was the feeling that Mark was deliberately testing him, trying to see how far he could push before Brian broke. Brian was determined not to give Mark the satisfaction of seeing him falter. A few days after the crates were delivered, Brian received a call from Allison, his lawyer. "I've got good news and bad news," she began, her tone brisk but serious. "The good news is, I've managed to get the zoning office to expedite their inspection. An official will be out there tomorrow to assess the situation. If they find any violations, and I'm certain they will, we can use it to push for immediate removal of the trench and the cable." Brian felt a glimmer of hope but stayed cautious. And the bad news. "The bad news," Allison continued, "is that Mark has filed a formal complaint against you with the local authorities. He's claiming that you've been harassing his workers and sabotaging his equipment. It's baseless, of course, but it's designed to muddy the waters and paint you as the aggressor." Brian's jaw tightened. "He's trying to turn this around on me." "Exactly," Allison said. "But don't worry. We've got the fire chief's report, photos and records of the damage he's caused to your property. Just stay calm and don't engage with him directly unless absolutely necessary. Let me handle the legal side." Brian thanked her and hung up, but the news left him uneasy. Mark's tactics were underhanded, but they were effective. By filing a complaint, Mark was trying to shift the narrative, making it harder for Brian to keep the focus on the real issue: the unauthorized trench and the cable. Brian decided to take Allison's advice and avoid direct confrontations, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was planning something bigger. The next day, the zoning inspector arrived, a middle-aged man named Dale who wore a neatly pressed shirt and carried a clipboard. Brian greeted him at the edge of the property and walked him over to the trench, explaining the situation as they went. Dale listened carefully, nodding as Brian described the damage to the irrigation system and the fire hazard caused by the sparking cable. When they reached the trench, Dale crouched down to examine the exposed cable, his brow furrowing. "This isn't just a violation," Dale said after a moment. "It's a disaster waiting to happen. The cable isn't buried to the required depth, and the insulation is substandard. If this thing overloads, it could cause a serious fire or worse." Brian felt a mix of relief and vindication. "So what happens now?" "I'll file a report with the zoning office," Dale said, standing up and making a few notes on his clipboard. "They'll issue a formal notice to the property owner, Mark, in this case demanding immediate removal of the trench and cable. If he doesn't comply, the county can impose fines or even take legal action." It was the first concrete step toward resolution that Brian had seen, and he thanked Dale for his thorough inspection. But as the inspector drove off, Brian's sense of unease returned. Mark wasn't the type to back down quietly, and Brian suspected he'd try to stall or find a way to circumvent the zoning office's demands. That suspicion proved correct later that evening when Brian received an email from Allison. "You're not going to believe this," the message began. "Mark has filed for a retroactive permit for the trench and cable. He's claiming the work is part of an energy-sharing initiative meant to benefit the community. It's a sham, of course, but it could delay enforcement while the permit is reviewed." Brian clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. Mark was nothing if not persistent, and his ability to manipulate the system was both infuriating and impressive. But Brian wasn't about to let him get away with it. He replied to Allison's email, asking her to challenge the permit application on the grounds of safety violations and lack of prior approval. If Mark wanted to play dirty, Brian was ready to fight back with every tool at his disposal. Over the next few days, tensions on the property reached a boiling point. One morning, Brian woke to find new orange flags marking the trench, this time extending even further onto his land. The sight made his blood boil. Mark wasn't just ignoring the zoning office's pending action, he was actively expanding his operation. Brian documented the new flags with photos and forwarded them to Allison, who promised to add them to the growing case file. That afternoon, things took an even more alarming turn. Brian was repairing a section of fencing near the trench when he heard the rumble of an engine. Looking up, he saw a group of workers driving onto his property in a small excavator. Without hesitation, Brian walked over to confront them. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice calm but firm. One of the workers, a stocky man in a hard hat, glanced at him without much interest. "We're here to expand the trench. Got orders from Mr. West." Brian's patience snapped. "This is my property, and you have no right to be here. Turn that thing around and get off my land before I call the sheriff." The worker hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Brian's tone. "Look, we're just following orders. If you've got a problem, take it up with Mark." "I already have Brian shot back. And I'm telling you right now, if you so much as touch one blade of grass on my property, I'll make sure you're held accountable for trespassing." The workers exchanged uneasy glances before finally relenting. The excavator rumbled to life, reversing back onto Mark's property. As they retreated, Brian felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. Mark wouldn't stop until he was forced to, and Brian knew he had to stay vigilant. That evening, as Brian reviewed the day's events with Allison over the phone, she suggested taking additional precautions. "Mark's getting desperate," she said. "I wouldn't be surprised if he tries something more aggressive to intimidate you. You might want to consider installing security cameras or motion sensors around the trench. It'll help you document any further trespassing and give you some peace of mind." Brian agreed, and the next day he purchased a set of weatherproof cameras and installed them along the perimeter of the trench. He also set up motion-activated floodlights to deter any nighttime activity. The measures gave him a sense of control, but they also served as a reminder of how far things had spiraled out of hand. What should have been a simple dispute over property rights had turned into a full-blown battle, and Brian was determined to see it through to the end. The following night, the cameras proved their worth. Around midnight, Brian was woken by an alert on his phone. Opening the security app, he saw a live feed of two men near the trench, carrying what looked like digging equipment. Without hesitation, Brian called the sheriff's department and reported the trespassers. This time, the deputies arrived quickly, catching the men in the act and escorting them off the property. Brian filed another report, adding it to the growing mountain of evidence against Mark. As he stood on his porch that night, watching the deputies' taillights disappear into the darkness, Brian felt a renewed sense of resolve. Mark had underestimated him, assuming he'd roll over and accept the intrusion. But Brian wasn't the kind of man to back down. This was his land, and he was going to fight for it no matter what it took. Brian awoke to the sound of distant machinery humming in the early hours of the morning. It wasn't unusual to hear farm equipment in the countryside, but this noise was coming from far too close. Sitting up, he checked the live feed on his security cameras. What he saw made his blood run cold. A group of men was gathered at the trench on his property, illuminated by harsh portable work lights. One of them was operating a small excavator, while another was unrolling a spool of industrial cable. They were clearly working quickly, and their intention was obvious. They were reinforcing the trench and extending the cable even further into Brian's land. Throwing on his boots and jacket, Brian grabbed his phone and headed outside, his pulse pounding in his ears. He didn't plan to confront them directly this time. He knew that Mark had grown bolder with each step of this process, and Brian wasn't about to risk a direct altercation without backup. Instead, he called the sheriff's department as he made his way across the property, explaining the situation in detail. The dispatcher assured him that deputies were en route. As he approached the trench, staying in the shadows of the trees, Brian crouched down to observe. The workers were focused on their task, shouting instructions to each other over the noise of the machinery. One of them was driving stakes into the ground to anchor the new section of cable, while another used a shovel to widen the trench. It was clear they were operating under Mark's orders, but what struck Brian most was their sense of urgency. They were moving quickly, almost as if they were racing against the clock. Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the stillness of the morning. The workers froze, looking around in panic as the flashing lights of sheriff's vehicles came into view. Brian stepped out of the shadows as two deputies arrived, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The workers immediately tried to explain themselves, claiming they were just contractors following instructions, but the deputies weren't interested. They asked Brian to confirm that this was his property and that the workers were there without his permission. When Brian nodded and showed them his documentation, the deputies ordered the men to stop their work and step away from the trench. Mark arrived minutes later, his truck skidding to a halt at the edge of the property. He jumped out, furious and red-faced, demanding to know why his workers were being stopped. "This is harassment," he shouted, pointing a finger at Brian. "You've been causing problems from day one, and now you're wasting law enforcement's time." Brian stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "You're the one trespassing on my property, Mark. You've been doing this without permits, without permission, and now you've been caught red-handed. I've given you every chance to make this right, but you've ignored every warning. This stops now." The deputies stepped in before the argument could escalate further. One of them turned to Mark, his tone authoritative. "Mr. West, we've received multiple complaints about your activities, and it's clear you've been operating without proper authorization. At this point, we're going to have to detain you for trespassing and violating property laws." Mark's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. "You can't arrest me. I have every right to be here. This is all a misunderstanding." But the deputies weren't swayed. They placed Mark in handcuffs while another officer collected statements from the workers, who were quick to distance themselves from the situation. One of them admitted they had been hired on short notice and hadn't seen any permits for the work. Their confession only added weight to Brian's case. As Mark was escorted to the squad car, he turned to Brian with a sneer. "You think you've won? This isn't over? You'll regret this." Brian didn't flinch. He'd heard enough empty threats from Mark to last a lifetime. Watching his neighbor being driven away was a small victory, but Brian knew the fight wasn't over yet. There was still the matter of the trench and the cable, which remained an unresolved safety hazard. The next day, Allison called with an update. The county zoning office had officially revoked Mark's retroactive permit application, citing numerous violations, including the lack of safety measures and unauthorized use of Brian's land. Additionally, the utility company had launched its own investigation into Mark's activities and discovered evidence of illegal power distribution. According to Allison, Mark was facing hefty fines and potential criminal charges. "That's not all," Allison added. "I've filed for an emergency injunction to have the trench filled and the cable removed immediately. With everything that's happened, the judge is likely to approve it." Brian felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, it seemed like the tide was finally turning in his favor. He thanked Allison for her hard work and hung up, allowing himself a rare moment to relax. But his relief was short-lived. That evening, as Brian walked his property to assess the damage from the workers' last intrusion, he noticed something odd near the trench. A faint metallic glint caught his eye, and as he got closer, he realized it was a small, black device partially buried in the soil. Pulling it free, he saw that it was a box with wires protruding from it, likely part of the unauthorized cable setup. But what truly unsettled him was the faint blinking red light on its side. It wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was something active. Unsure of what he was dealing with, Brian carefully placed the device in a secure container and brought it back to his barn. He contacted the sheriff's department and the utility company to report the find, and both promised to send someone to investigate. In the meantime, Brian decided to keep the device safe but untouched, unwilling to take any chances. The next morning, a team from the utility company arrived, along with an investigator from the sheriff's office. They examined the device and confirmed Brian's suspicions it was part of an illegal power monitoring system, likely used to track energy flow and profits from the unauthorized distribution network. The utility company representative assured Brian that the entire cable setup would be dismantled within days and that Mark's operation would be shut down for good. As the workers began removing the cable and filling in the trench, Brian stood by and watched, feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. It had been a long, grueling battle, but he'd stood his ground and fought for what was right. Mark's arrogance and disregard for boundaries had cost him dearly, while Brian's patience and determination had finally paid off. When the last piece of cable was hauled away and the trench was filled, Brian walked the length of his property, taking in the sight of his land restored. He knew it would take time to repair the damage completely, but for now, he could finally breathe easy. This was his home, his sanctuary, and no one, not even someone as stubborn as Mark, was going to take that away from him. In the weeks that followed the final removal of the cable and the trench being filled, Brian's property began to feel like his own again. The signs of the battle with Mark were still visible: disturbed soil where the trench had been, patches of grass that would take months to regrow, and the lingering unease that came from months of conflict, but there was also a sense of peace slowly returning. The absence of the humming generator and the workers who had intruded on his land was a relief, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Brian could focus on the reason he'd bought the property in the first place: his farm. The legal aftermath of the ordeal unfolded swiftly. Mark's illegal activities had come to light in full force. Between the utility company's investigation and the sheriff's department uncovering his unauthorized power distribution network, he was facing not only fines but also criminal charges. Brian learned through Allison that Mark had been operating a large-scale illegal operation, using the trench and cable on Brian's land as a crucial part of his scheme. The battery packs and generator were all part of a system designed to sell electricity off the grid, bypassing regulations and safety standards. It wasn't just reckless, it was outright dangerous. The court ruled decisively in Brian's favor. Mark was ordered to pay damages for the destruction of Brian's irrigation system and the costs of repairing the land. Additionally, the judge imposed a restraining order, preventing Mark from stepping foot on Brian's property again. Allison's persistence and careful documentation of every detail had ensured a thorough and definitive victory. When Brian received the official court documents confirming the judgment, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. Mark, however, wasn't faring so well. Facing mounting legal and financial troubles, he put his property up for sale and moved out of the area entirely. Rumors swirled among the neighbors about where he'd gone and what would happen to him, but Brian didn't care. Mark's absence was all that mattered. Without his constant provocations, the tension that had gripped the area finally began to ease. Despite the relief of victory, the experience had left its mark on Brian. He couldn't help but approach his land with a heightened sense of vigilance, knowing how quickly a peaceful life could be disrupted. He reinforced his property lines, adding clear signage to mark his boundaries and installing additional security cameras. The cameras had proven invaluable during the conflict, and now they gave him a sense of security he hadn't realized he needed before. But not everything about the ordeal had been negative. Several neighbors, previously distant or indifferent, reached out to Brian to express their support after hearing about his victory. Some apologized for not stepping in earlier, admitting they'd been intimidated by Mark's domineering personality. Brian, ever practical, accepted their apologies with a nod and a handshake. It wasn't in his nature to hold grudges, and if anything, he was grateful that the experience had forged new connections within the community. A few even offered to help him repair the damaged sections of his land, which he appreciated deeply. One sunny morning, as Brian worked to reseed the grass where the trench had been, he paused to take in the view of his property. The rolling hills, the fields where his livestock grazed, the quiet stillness of the countryside, it was everything he had dreamed of when he first purchased the land. The scars left by the trench and the conflict with Mark were still there, but they felt less significant now. With time, the land would heal, just as he had. Brian also felt a newfound sense of resilience. The ordeal had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, forcing him to navigate legal battles, stand firm against intimidation, and protect what was his. But he'd come through it stronger, more determined, and more confident in his ability to face challenges. His land was more than just a farm, it was a testament to his perseverance, a symbol of what it meant to stand up for oneself even when the odds seemed overwhelming. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the property in golden light, Brian stood at the edge of his field and watched his livestock roam freely. The pastures were quiet again, save for the soft rustling of the breeze and the occasional bleat of a sheep. For the first time in months, he felt a profound sense of peace. This was his land, his sanctuary, and no one would ever take that from him again.